I've written it as Cosmology 101 because this is, I guess most of you, if you have any background in cosmology, will know what I'm going to talk for this 1.5 hours. Okay. So how many of you have read this book? Or have seen so there is a television series, it was in, I think, early 80s sometime, but it is available in internet. So if you have not seen it, you should see it. Carl Sagan was a theoretical physicist, and he was also involved in the Voyager missions. And he wrote this book and also directed this series. This tells you everything about the cosmology, at least known up to 1980s, but we have gone a long way since then. The opening line in this book says that cosmos is what was, what is, and what will be, which means everything. And you know, logy means the study of what is, study of anything. So cosmology is study of everything. But that is not what we mean by cosmology usually, at least for this school. So we'll mean by study of the universe at the largest scale, as Kopoma said. And when you say the study of the universe, it will have two parts, like theory and observations. I will mostly do the theory, but I will also trace on some of the observations. Cosmology was a theory for the first 2-3 decades of the Earth, maybe more than that. 4 or 5 decades of 19th century, 20th century, so 1950, something like that. But after that, we start to have very precision instruments such that we could also do observation to test those theories and measure the parameters of those theories. So I will tell you what I precisely mean by test those theories and measure the parameters of those theories. So cosmology is no different than any other physics subjects. All the physics subjects has these two parts, theory and observation. But again, to trace on that word observation, I will say that cosmology is different from any other physics subjects. In a sense, astrophysics itself is different from any other physics subjects because there you cannot do any observation, cannot do any experiment, as again Takuma said. Because you cannot, see, if you are measuring some property of a galaxy, you cannot go to the galaxy, change the property a little bit and measure it again and see what is the effect of, say, the intervening medium from the galaxy to you, which we do always when we do a laboratory experiment, right? So we are measuring some property y, which is a function of x. We change x, give it different values, and try to see how it is depending on y. That you cannot do in cosmology. So you can only do observation, whatever is given to you, and from that only we can infer things. Good. So let us start with one observation. So what is this? No, that's fine. What is this? This is Milky Way, right? So if I go to a place where there is less light pollution and there is not much cloud in the sky, I see a lot of stars in the sky. But if you look closely, the stars are not distributed like very homogeneously in the sky. So every direction you see, you don't see equal number of stars. Rather, what you see is you see a patch in the sky where you have more stars than anywhere else. This was known to the very ancient observers, and only very recently, in 1900 and so, people started to ask the question, what this is. Now we know, of course, now what this is, but the way it began was by something called number counts. So we'll come to number counts in detail later, but let me give you a very brief outline of what we mean by number count. Say we are in a star, so this is sun, and we have so many stars around us. Now if these stars are homogeneously distributed around us, what will we see? If we say that we can, okay, so let us assume that we can estimate the distance to all these stars very carefully. So we set a radius like this and estimate the number of stars inside that radius. So we'll count, say, five stars. To increase the radius a little bit, we see the number of stars has changed to something else. Now, how this number of stars changes will actually tells you how they are distributed in the sky, right? So if there are more stars near to you, as you go further and further away, the increase in the number of stars will be less. Like, say the stars are limited to this space only. If I increase my radius from here to here, the number of stars inside my radius doesn't change. So that essentially tells you that all the stars are limited to this region. So this method is called number counts. So you count the number of stars within a given radius from you, and try to infer what is the shape of the stars, how the stars are distributed around. You can do better. As you can see here, if I divide it in say 3 parts angularly and ask the question how many stars inside this part or this part or this part, the number is almost the same. While here, I will essentially get more stars in this direction than the other direction. So which means now I can have a direction dependent idea of how these stars are distributed. And if you go back to the previous picture, that is exactly what you want, because only in those directions you have more stars, in the other directions you have less stars. So number counts was used by William Herschel. It's back in 1785. So he had a telescope to look at and estimate the distance to the stars. And this is his picture of our galaxy. This is in his understanding. So he measured the stars to different distances, and these are the most distant stars he could measure. So he put them in a diagram and find out how the galaxy looks like. And of course this picture is wrong. And in this picture, our sun was somewhere at the center, which is again wrong. Well, why it was wrong? Okay, before going to why it was wrong, let me tell you how the galaxy looks like. So this everybody knows, right? That our galaxy looks like a disk. So first of all, it's a disk. It's like a CD, which has very small thickness compared to the radius. The radius is around, how much? Radius is around 40 kiloparsec, and the thickness is around, say, 100 parsec. So we'll come to what is a parsec, what is a kiloparsec, but as you can see, the diameter or radius is like 400 times, 200 to 400 times more than the thickness. So it's a very thin disk. On top of that, at the center you have something called a bulge, where most of the stars are distributed. There's a very high density of stars here. And then from there, you have these arms going around. So it's a spiral structure. And this entire thing is also rotating. This is the view of, this is our vantage point. This is sun, from where you look at around. So if you look this direction, you will see very less amount of stars. If you see along these directions, you see a lot of stars. If you see along the plane, you see a lot of stars. And that's how you make that ring in the sky. Good. Now, why Herschel was wrong? He had this picture instead of this picture. The reason is that for number count to be accurate, you need to have very accurate distance to the stars. So he had the wrong distances. He could not measure the distances very accurately. So the first thing you should know in cosmology is how to measure distances to different objects. Well, if you think of it, that is how it should be, right? Because if I have, say I want to measure the trajectory of a particle, there are two things that I have to measure very accurately. One is distance, one is time. So it is the distance which was wrong in this case, and we will learn how to measure distances very accurately. Okay. So our distance measurement starts with the smallest unit, which is 1 astronomical unit, AU capital. If it becomes small, it will become atomic unit, which will be the other extreme. But 1 astronomical unit is the distance between, average distance between Sun and Earth, right? So if I want to measure the distance to a very large object, what I should do first is I should use a scale which is calibrated to a known distance. That's always we do, right? If I want to measure the distance to this room, the length of this room, I use a meter stick. So I have a very good understanding of how 1 meter is. Then I measure how many meters is this room. So this is the first meter stick that we have in astronomy. And then once you want to measure the distance between, say, Pilani and Delhi, you cannot measure it in meters, you have to measure it in kilometers. Once you want to measure the distance in Earth and Sun, then you go to astronomical unit. So I will start from here. Now you can ask the question, how people come to know what is the distance between Earth and Sun? The first measurement was by transit of Venus. So I will request you to look up the internet to find out how Earth to Sun distance was first measured. Nowadays, you can do a lot better things. You can send a signal. So in moon missions, these Apollo missions, they have put retro reflectors in the moon. So what is a retro reflector? It's basically, you can think of the mirror like this. So if any signal comes from any angle, it goes back in the same angle. So it's 45 degree, 2 mirrors. This is 90 degrees. So what is done is you send laser, very high power laser beam to moon towards that retro reflector. It comes back. You measure the time delay, and from that you get the distance to the moon. So once you know one astronomical distance, it's easy to know all the other astronomical distances just using say Kepler's laws. Okay, so our distance measurement starts with astronomical unit, and then we use astronomical unit to define a quantity called parsec. So how do you do it? Say I have very sensitive telescope, and I can measure the position of a star in the sky. Okay. Now, as you see, this is Sun, and say this is January, and this is 6 months after January. So Earth is at the two diametrically opposite point in its orbit. So this distance is 2 AU. Now when you look at a star which is somewhere in the sky, you will be essentially looking at two different directions. So this picture is of course very, very exaggerated, but you will essentially be looking at two different directions if you look at any star in the sky, if the star is not along this line, of course. And if you can measure that angle between the two directions, if you can measure that angle, then from that angle, and you know, so for this triangle, you know this, and you know that angle, so you can measure that distance to the star. Right? So this is called parallax distance, and if your delta is 1 arc second, so the distance that 1 arc second, that angle will be 1 arc second, is called 1 parsec. It's per second basically. And 1 parsec, if you convert it to meter, it's a huge distance, 3 into 10 to the 16 meter. Well, I am not talking about the other obvious distance measure, which is light year, and you all know about it. It's how much light goes in 1 year, right? And you can find out 1 parsec is how much light years. It's around 3.25, 3.26 light years. Now, let me ask you one question. So, so all this method, whether this method will work or not, depends on whether you can measure this very small angle delta, right? Which means you need to have a telescope which has very high resolution. High resolution means if I have a star here and a star very nearby, or this is the same star looked from two different points in the Earth's orbit, my telescope should be able to make the difference between these two angles. Right? So my telescope should have very high resolution. Now tell me, so as I came to know that we have here in BITS Pilani have a 11-inch reflector, right? Who is from BITS Pilani? 11-inch reflector. So for 11-inch, what will be the angular resolution? Who is calculating? So take lambda to be 5000 angstrom. So take this to be half a meter, as that things becomes easier. No. So what is Rayleigh's criteria? Delta is, so whatever, so I call it, say, delta theta or something. It's lambda by d. What is that d?
D will make the distance from the point, from the telescope to...
No.
Oh, that's the, sorry, that's the size of...
This is a property of the telescope, not of the sky, right? I carefully matched 5 here and 5 here. Tell me arc seconds. (5,000 angstrom is how much meters? 10 or 12? 10, right? So I have to convert it to pi is almost 3. So how much is it? 0.1? Around? So it's 0.1 arc second approximately. It can be 1 arc second, it can be 0.01 arc second if you have done it wrong, so it doesn't matter. The point is that if I have a telescope of 0.5 meter diameter, I have something like 0.1 arc second resolution. So then I will be able to measure distance up to certain. So dP has a maximum value now, right? If the star is farther away, I cannot measure the angle between the two positions of the star in the sky. 6 months apart, I cannot measure the distance to the star. Now, the interesting thing is, this will never be 0.1 arc second with your telescope, even if it is 0.1 arc second calculated from this formula. Can you tell me why? So let me tell you, give you an hint, that all the Earth-based telescopes has resolution of around 1 arc second. So there is something not right in that statement, which I will clarify later. But if you have a mirror of diameter 0.5 meter, or say a 2 meter diameter mirror, like the Iuka Giravali telescope, both of them has 1 arc second resolution. You cannot go better than 1 arc second by observing them, using them. So can you tell me why? simply because of the atmosphere. So our light is not transparent. Electromagnetic wave, the part of electromagnetic wave that we see, is not completely transparent through the atmosphere. And because of that, what happens is you have scattering, you have a lot of turbulence going on in the atmosphere, and that limits your resolution. So now your D, which sits here, is actually going to be the smallest patch in the sky, which is kind of coherent. So why do you put a D there? You remember you have a mirror or a lens in your telescope, which accumulates the light in phase to your CCD or whatever you put there, right? So all these electromagnetic rays or light goes there in phase. That's what a focus is. But if I now have small atmospheric patches here, the amount of light that can go in phase has only this much of weight. So it reduces the size of the effective diameter of the mirror. And for arc-based cases, you can go as base as 1 arcsecond. Well, as I said, that is not entirely true, because now we have technologies called adaptive optics and active optics, which measures how much is the change in the waveform because of the atmosphere and corrects for it. But that also can let you go up to around this, so 0.1 arcsecond. So if you have adaptive optics in your active optics in your telescope, 11-inch mirror telescope, you will be able to see 0.1 arcsecond. But then you can ask the question, oh, that's fine. My 2-meter telescope or 5-meter telescope is having 1 arcsecond resolution, and my 11-inch telescope has also having 1 arcsecond resolution. Then why build so big, huge telescopes, and which cost a lot of money? The reason is, of course, that with the size of the dish, you also gather a lot of more light. So you see fainter objects, which is, so it's not always resolving to stars which are nearby. It's also looking at fainter objects. Once you gather more light, you can do more interesting thing like spectroscopy. You can measure the spectral response of that object. Okay, so now if I want to beat this, I have to go to space where you don't have atmosphere. So Hubble Space Telescope has a mirror of around 0.2 meters, and that can go up to 0.01 arcsecond, which is very high resolution compared to what you can see from here. Now, the point of telling all this is, so there is a satellite which was launched called Hipparcos satellite that went up just to measure the parallax distance of the stars nearby. So the maximum you can measure. And it has published a catalog called Tycho 2 catalog, which has these many stars parallax measured. It has more other things. But as you can see that now we have distance measured to these many stars. So you can do a lot better job. But that is not good enough, of course. You have to go to larger distances. So how do you go to larger distances? Well, one reason for measuring distance to very large number of stars is also to establish the next ladder. So we have gone from 1 astronomical unit to 1 parsec, right? Now we need to have something else to establish the next ladder, so to go to even larger scales. As we have already seen that this parallax distance has a limitation. So how can I go to larger scales? So I need to have some stars which has certain properties which is independent of the distance, and then I have measured the distance to those stars within those Hipparcos Tycho 2 catalog. And one such stars are called Cepheid variables. So what is interesting with this is, the Cepheid variables are stars which oscillates, and as it oscillates, the amount of energy coming out of it, or the luminosity, changes with time, periodically. And the more the period, the more the change in the absolute magnitude or absolute luminosity. So magnitude and luminosity are, you can use one for the other, absolute magnitude and luminosity. We'll come to what are the definitions for those later. So basically, if I see a CFEED with, say, 30-day period, I know what its absolute magnitude is or its luminosity is, how much light it is emitting, that I know. Once I know what is its period. A period is something that you can observe. So it's 30 days, so every day you observe every day you measure the amount of light coming from that star to you. You see an oscillation, just like that. From that, you can measure the period of that oscillation, and then once you put that period of that oscillation in this plot, you know the luminosity or the magnitude, absolute magnitude of that object. And once you know the absolute magnitude, so what is absolute magnitude? Or the luminosity, it's the amount of energy radiated by it. But then you observe a very small part of it, depending on how far you are, right? It's radiated isotropically, so it falls as 1 by r squared. So once you know, so now, what this actual or absolute luminosity is, and if I measure it here, I'll measure something like this, right? So I know this by that period luminosity relation. I measure this, I get the distance. So that is how you use CFEED variables to measure the distance. Okay. So this kind of distance is called luminosity distance, which again will come back tomorrow, more about luminosity distance and how is it relevant to cosmology. Going backwards. So then if you go to even larger distances, you now need something even more interesting, because this luminosity change is now difficult to measure, because you are going to so far distance that the stars are getting fainter and fainter. So you need some star or something which has very large luminosity. And one such thing is supernova. So when a star dies, it throws away its outer shell, and the luminosity increases by 1,000 folds. Sometimes it suppresses the luminosity of the host galaxy. So galaxy has like 10 to the 11th star. One star, when it goes to supernova, has more luminosity than all 10 to the 11th stars. So if it is even farther, very far away, you can still see it. And there also, you have a relation between how this, so this is so-called light curve of the supernova. So this explosion occurred somewhere here, and it is recorded at different days. So these are called Julian days, but don't bother about them. So basically, every day you measure the luminosity, it goes high very rapidly, and then it has a decline. And the slower is the decline, the lighter is the absolute luminosity. So if you have a very fast decline, then your absolute luminosity is more. If your decline is slower, your absolute luminosity is less. So again, using that, how this decline is, you can know this quantity. And you measure this quantity, and you get the distance R. So this supernova is the workhorse of measuring distances right now. And as you know that, okay, we'll come to that. But this is the cosmic distance ladder that I have been talking about. This radar ranging is the lunar experiment that I told you. Then you have the stellar parallax. Then you have something called spectroscopic parallax, which I did not tell you. But if you already know, then I can explain it to you. If you know HR diagram, which is how the magnitude and say temperature of the stars are related. And there is something called this class of stars which are called main sequence, which falls in a certain part of the HR diagram. And by measuring the temperature of the star, you can actually measure the luminosity of the star using HR diagram. But let's not go into the detail of that, because then I have to go in deep to something else. But that is a missing link between the stellar parallax I told you and the variable star I told you. But even you can bypass this spectroscopic parallax, or this is something also sometimes also called tip of the red giant branch method. So for a galaxy where you don't have a supernova or you don't have a variable star, you usually use that method. But anyway, so beyond that you have those variable stars. Then you also have the supernova that I told you, and then I did not tell you about Pauly-Fisher relation, which is that there is for the galaxies, you have a certain relation between the rotational velocity of the galaxy and the mass of the galaxy, or the luminosity of the galaxy, so which is called Pauly-Fisher relation. It's an empirical relation again, so you really don't know whether it will be valid for a given galaxy, but if you have many galaxies together, which are called galaxy cluster, you can still use that relation to find out the distance to that galaxy cluster. And then you have the supernova that I have told you. So this is called the cosmic distance ladder, and that is how we measure the distances.
Sir, how do we spot a supernova? Like suppose
Good question. So there are supernova surveys, and I will come to one of them because supernova surveys has got 3 Nobel Prizes, 2010, 2011. So what you do is you have dedicated telescopes, which are small telescopes because these are very bright things, and they look at the supernovas all the time. They look at the patch of the sky all the time, and then you take different images. So you take the image now, take the image say after 10 minutes or so, and you subtract these 2 images. If there is a supernova, from the subtraction images, all the other stars are same, right? The supernova will show up. So now once you have found there the supernova, this cannot be done with all different kinds of supernovas. There is only one kind, type 1 is supernova, with which this can be done. And to differentiate between these different kinds of supernovas using spectroscopic classifications. So what you do is, once this telescope has told you that at that direction there is possibly a supernova, then there are other telescopes which are bigger telescopes, and now you can look at those directions. And then they will do spectroscopy. And then if they confirm that yes, there is a supernova, because this can be done within say 10 hours time scale, then that particular supernova will be observed for say 100 days, and you get the light curve. Once you get the light curve, the rest is easy. Okay. So there is lots of surveys, at least 2 surveys going on to do this method, because this is the method with which you can go the furthest in the sky now. Okay. So let me tell you, this is kind of philosophy, that in physics we do 2 things. The ultimate thing that we always like to do is to find the trajectory of a particle, or in this case the trajectory of the universe. Okay. So we want to know what will happen to us after some 10,000 years, not us, but the universe. And when you say trajectory, you can use with some approximation the Newton's law of motion, right? And then you have to now know the trajectory, the initial conditions. One of them we are measuring, like the distance at different points. So you can have either boundary conditions or initial conditions there. So you can measure distance at different points in time, and then you need to know this quantity phi. And how is phi? How do you know phi? Because you know this force law, which is in this case the gravitation force law. And I can see the point. And again, when I say gravitation force law, G is of course an universal constant. You have measured it in the lab. So you need to know this thing, which is rho, the density parameters. So now, if you ask the question, what will the universe will look like after certain decades, you need to do 2 things. One is that you have to measure the distance to different stars or different objects in the universe. Other is that to know what is rho for the universe. What are the things which constitutes the universe? So let us look back to the galaxy first. We have asked the question that what is the shape of the galaxy. Let us ask, what is the galaxy made of? So this is our galaxy. So how many of you think that this picture is taken by a camera or telescope? This picture cannot be taken by a camera or telescope because This is supposed to be our galaxy, and we sit inside it. Nothing has gone outside our galaxy, which is man-made, right? So this is a artist drawn picture. And this is how the stellar distribution in our galaxy should look like. And now this is how our galaxy looks like when you look at different wavelengths. So stars emit mostly visible lights, what the light we can see. But it's not the only part of the electromagnetic spectrum. You have a lot of other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum going from gamma ray to the X-rays, gamma ray to the radio wavelengths. And in different wavelengths, you get to see different part of the galaxy. So this is star, that is star. This is star. But when you go to infrared, you see that in between the stars you have dust. Next you see hot gas. You see molecular hydrogen, you see atomic hydrogen, you see a lot of things. So in between the stars, you have what is called the interstellar medium. But if I tell you, this interstellar medium, if I ask how much is the mass of this interstellar medium, it's just 1/10 the mass of the star. So it's very small in terms of mass. So it's even small in terms of density because it's kind of diffuse medium. Stars which are massive are kind of point objects in that galaxy. Okay. So that is how our galaxy is made out. So it's all these different constituents. So let us ask what the universe is made of. This picture is taken by Hubble Space Telescope. This is moon. This is the size of the moon. This moon is not taken as a part of this picture. This is the size of the moon. This is 1/2 degree in the sky. You cannot see a box over here, which is the size of this picture compared to the size of the moon. So you can see it's a very small part of the sky. And you see so many galaxies there. And all of these galaxies are made up of mostly stars and a little bit of interstellar medium. And that is all you can see using all your electromagnetic wavelengths. So for one galaxy, you have seen that this is what you see using your entire electromagnetic wavelength range. And this is only using optical wavelengths. But these are the galaxies. So outside the galaxy, you don't have an interstellar medium. So this is mostly what you have in the universe, the visible universe. And these are called the normal matters or baryons in case of astronomy. And surprisingly enough, they are only 4% of the universe. They constitutes, they makes only 4% of the universe. So let's ask, what is the rest? Well, again, so this is one galaxy and the stars of this galaxy, right? And I already told you that it has also interstellar medium. And the most of the interstellar medium is again neutral hydrogen. And this is how the same galaxy will look if you make a neutral hydrogen map of the galaxy. So this thing. And the stellar part will reside within that circle. It's that small. And then this is the amount of neutral hydrogen there. So this is the density of the neutral hydrogen. And then this galaxy is rotating. So if I ask the question, how does the velocity looks like at different parts of the galaxy? This is how it looks like. So different colors have different velocities. So this part has one velocity, then it's systematically changing because you have a rotation of the galaxy. And since you can measure these things, you can actually measure how the rotation, the tangential rotation velocity varies with the radius from the center. And that is plotted here. So this is the radius from the center of the galaxy, and this is the tangential rotation velocity, and these points with error bars are the measurements. Okay. Now for the same galaxy, we have a picture of the galaxy using stars, and we already said that that's the most of the matter. So let us put that matter, that stellar matter here, and ask the question, how should my velocity look like? And if you do that, you find that you get a rotation curve which looks like this. Okay. And if you want to make the rotation curve look like this, which is matching with the galaxy, with the measured rotation values, then you have to add a quantity, a matter, which does not have, which you cannot see, of course, because all you see is there in the star or the gas. You have to add a quantity which is called halo over here, which has the rotation curve because of that will look like this. Well, basically, essentially what it is saying is, this picture is saying is, that the rotation curve which you get from this formula, putting in some matter here, which you see, does not reproduce what rotation curve you actually see in the galaxy. So you need to put in extra matter inside. And that extra matter is something that you cannot see. And that's why that matter is called the dark matter. So that's how the dark matter idea came. And that constitutes another 22% of the galaxy, of the universe. So what is the rest of the universe? Okay, so this picture, as I showed you before, is called Hubble Deep Field because it was taken with Hubble Space Telescope with a very long exposure time. So it's, I think, 10 days exposure time. Just imagine. You can know I do a 10 days exposure. What do you?
There's a question.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah.
So in the previous slide, where
Yeah.
we equated the radiation pollution using the acceleration,
Yeah.
are we assuming that most of the mass is concentrated at the center? Would we use a distribution for the mass?
No, you can use a distribution for the mass. So this formula which I had written, this one, is a very crude formula, right? This assumes, so when I write Gm by r square, it assumes a spherically symmetric distribution. But that is not required when you are actually calculating this curve. Because you, from the optical observation, you know how much is the mass, right?
Also, it does work with the total mass. And
It does work with the total mass. It doesn't, I mean, so other way to say it doesn't work with the total mass. I mean, if you put in the total mass, optical, and say H1,
And
you don't get that, reproduce that rotation curve. So you need to add an extra mass.
no, even after we, for example, we add the dark matter halo, and then this single formula, we're just adding.
No. This formula, as I again told you, this is just a this is just for demonstration purpose. You take into account the distribution of the, and you also, from fitting the rotation curve, you also get how much dark matter also varies with radius. The density of dark matter varies with radius. There are different models called NFW, Navarro-Frank halo profile, and then isothermal halo profile, which people try to fit into these dark matter models. So this is Hubble Deep Field, and this is taken with this telescope. And if you have recently seen the movie Gravity, there this was pictured. I wanted to show you that. And this is the person on which the space telescope is named on, because he is the person actually who started cosmology. And he used this telescope, not the Hubble Space Telescope, of course. This is a 100-inch Mount Palomar telescope. And believe it or not, this telescope is a very old telescope. It's now it's 100 years, more than 100 years old. And this has done more science than any other telescope in the world. So what did he do? So he measured the spectra of what he called the nebula. You know them as galaxies now. He measured the spectra of the galaxies. And he also measured the distance. So he used this Cepheid method of measuring the distance, Cepheid variable method of measuring the distance. And what did he saw? He observed two things. One is the galaxies has redshifted spectra. So for each galaxy, so what do I mean by spectra? If I look at a galaxy, I will definitely see some spectral lines in that galaxy. So say this is coming from some iron, this is coming from some silicon or something. I'm just making up things. And I know exactly what lambda this should come. I know what lambda this should come. Right? Now when I observe it for a given galaxy, I see that these lambdas have increased. So this has come here, and this has come here. Okay? And this difference compared to the native wavelength is called the redshift. So he saw that all the galaxies has redshifted spectra. This is the first observation. The second thing he saw is, the farther is the galaxy, as I have already told you, we have measured the distance. So farther is the galaxy, more is the redshift. Now he observed redshift, so I am tracing on that. He observed redshift. Did not measure the velocity, but he assumed that redshift is because of the fact that the galaxies are moving away from us. So you know that if something is moving away from us, the light emitted from it will be redshifted, right? So you assume that the galaxy's spectra is redshifted because they are moving away from us. Okay. So then you can associate a velocity with those galaxies. This thing. So say I have a galaxy in my laboratory somehow, and I observe it and measure the spectra of it. And I see that there are two lines, corresponds to lambda 1 and lambda 2, corresponds to some iron and some silicon line. Okay. Now, Hubble saw that if that galaxy is some further distance away, you see similar spectral signature, but not at lambda 1, lambda 2, but say some lambda 1 plus delta lambda 1, lambda 2 plus delta lambda 2. Okay. And you defined redshift by delta lambda by lambda. And this quantity is same for both of them, both the lines. Okay. So that tells you that they have, this entire galaxy has a redshift. It's not that one line is going somewhere, the other line is going somewhere else. The entire galaxy has a redshift. That's what he observed. The other thing he observed was that further the galaxy, more is the redshift. And then he plotted this very courageous diagram. So these are the points he measured. This is distance. Sorry, because this was a very low resolution picture that I got from the internet. So this is distance, and this is, as I said, he converted it to velocity. And he got all these points, and he was very courageous to draw a straight line among these points. It's very difficult to imagine a straight line among those points. But as you will see that that's actually a straight line right now. So then he said that this is the relation, that the empirical relation that you see from the observation. Farthest is the distance from the galaxy, more is the velocity, and that constant is called the Hubble's constant. Okay. So now how do you understand it? Is that we are in a very special position and all the galaxies are going away from us, and all the galaxies knows how far it is from us, and then they will move away faster. So that should not be the case, right? So let's assume that
How we measure the distance?
circuit variables. That's what Hubble did. But now you use supernovas because you go further.
And velocity is related to what?
Velocity is related to. So if you have something going away from you and it's radiating, you know that it has a redshift which is V by C. Right? So Hubble observed this and he thought that the galaxies are going away. So he associated a velocity with it. Understand? I am not saying that the galaxies are going away. Hubble said that I observe a galaxy with a redshift Z. So I'll assume that it's going away, then I can associate a velocity with it.
The velocity is related to us, I mean, from the.
Velocity respect to us, of course. Everything is respect to us. That's the only point from which you can measure. Okay. So let's assume that we live in an expanding universe, and let's assume further. Okay. So when you try to do theory, you try to simplify things beyond your imagination. So you try to simplify things saying here that you have only one dimensional universe and the other dimension is time. Okay. And this universe is expanding with time. So I will tell you what do I mean by that. So this is my cartoon universe. That line is some reference line, which is my linear direction. And these are the galaxies, which sits almost evenly spaced now. at time t, and at time t plus delta t, what happens is, so this direction is time. So in this direction, time increases up to down. At time t plus delta t, what happens is the universe expands. So this appears to be bigger. Okay. Now let us choose a galaxy which is our galaxy from where we look at different things. And then I have changed the color. So this is a galaxy at that point of time. This is our galaxy at t plus delta t. And let us put these vertical lines, which are basically showing where this galaxy was at time t. Okay. This has of course come here. And this difference in this axis is delta t, of course. That one will cause some problem. Now what has happened? This galaxy has come here, this galaxy has gone there, this galaxy has gone there, like that. Right? Now, what is velocity? Unfortunately, that has not come. So velocity is nothing but delta h by delta t, right? So let us measure how much this galaxy has appeared to have traveled. It has traveled delta x. The galaxy has not traveled, the universe has expanded, but with reference to its previous point in the universe, it has appeared to have traveled this delta x, right? This galaxy has traveled a little further, right? Now what is the consequence? As you can see, delta t is same for all of them. This will give you a larger velocity. Sorry, this will give you a smaller velocity compared to this. Is this clear? Which means this galaxy, which is further away, is now moving away from us, appear to move away from us with a larger velocity. So if I assume that the universe is anyway homogeneous, in the sense that these are equally spaced, and it's expanding with time, then I can reproduce what Hubble observed. Okay. Now you may say that I carefully drew this galaxy just below it. So is it true for any galaxy? Because if it is not true for any galaxy, again it's a law which is only true for our galaxy. It should not be the case, right? So let's choose another galaxy which is not aligned to start with. But then if I choose that galaxy to be my vintage point, to my observing point, I can shift this to here, right? Because that's what you mean by observing from that galaxy. You are standing there. And if you do the same thing happens. This is further than this one. So further is the galaxy, farthest is the redshift, or farthest is the apparent velocity. So this tells you that this works for a homogeneous universe, for homogeneous expanding universe. If I assume that, then I can explain Hubble's law. And then this is the modern version of the Hubble's plot. So now x-axis is redshift, and y-axis is something called the magnitude of whatever is observed. And so we'll come to how this magnitude is related to redshift. But this is essentially the same plot as Hubble did. And you see, it has gone to very, very high redshifts. Now it's around 1. So Hubble's time, it was very, very small, 0.01 or something. And this, now as you can measure up to larger distances, you see that the universe is not only expanding, the expansion is getting accelerated. Okay, and that gave 2011 Nobel Prize to these three people. So what they have been doing is, again, they have been doing this supernova surveys such that you can measure distance to very larger objects. And once you can measure distance to very larger objects, first thing you can measure is the velocity. Then you can measure the acceleration as you go to even further, right? Because that's a second order thing in your Taylor expansion, if you think of. So that they did. And for the discovery of the accelerating expansion of the universe through observations of distant supernova, they got the Nobel Prize, 2011. So if you are doing cosmology, you can get a Nobel Prize. Okay, so that's the bottom line of everything, that universe has accelerated expansion. Now think of it. The gravity pulls things together, right? So the universe is made up of things which gravitates, and they're supposed to pull things together. So as time goes by, though it is expanding, it should come back sometime. But that does, not only that doesn't happen, it accelerates away. So there should be something which is pushing things further and further. And that extra part in the universe, which is again not known, is termed as dark energy. And that is the most of the universe, 74% of it. Okay? So that finishes up our universe pie chart. I shall be talking about the most of the entity, but there is a dark energy extra thing, is it? In that school. So we'll know more about dark energy.
Sir, since we are looking at the universe with a very small window of time, so we cannot say that this is only due to the expansion like that.
Okay.
So it may be some sort of explosion or something.
Good. Now the point is that you are actually not looking at the universe through a very small window of time, because light takes times to reach you. So if I am looking at something which is 10 light years away, how long does the light takes to reach you? 10 years. So we are looking at things which has happened in the universe 10 years back. So we are actually looking at 10 to the 6 or 10 to the 9 light years back, which is long back in the universe. And how far you can look at in the universe, we will talk about that in a few while. Yeah.
So then, how do you say that today the acceleration is this much in the universe? Whatever we do the experiments is from the supernova, which is very distant. So we are finding the acceleration in the past. How do we find it?
Right. So how do you say that what is the acceleration today? So there is a particular parameter called q dot that they measure. So as I told you, h. This is the Hubble's law we wrote down, right? So this is usually written like this. H naught is today. So similarly, this is the, if you think of Taylor expansion of some quantity, this is the first term in that Taylor expansion, gives you this. The second term gives you q naught, which measures the acceleration at present day, which is what they measures. But how it is done will come, I think tomorrow we will talk about that. Exactly mathematically, so that there will be no ambiguity. Because I don't want to go ahead. So is there any physical theory now which explains this accelerated expansion? Do we have a physical theory which will automatically give you the accelerated expansion? So welcome to the class of, welcome to the cosmology school, because that's what we will be talking about. Well, this theory is called Big Bang theory, but not this one, but this one. So as you can think that all these galaxies are apparently moving away from you, if you run the movie backwards, they will be coming closer together. So if I think of a volume, say I have a constant volume somehow fixed in the universe. Say I have this parallax distance and I cannot measure distance over some radius in the universe. Okay. And I measure how many galaxies are there inside this universe. Okay. And I get a number now n. If I measure it after say 100 years, what will happen to this number n? It will decrease, right? So what happens as the universe expands is the density in the universe decreases. Okay? So what happens if you run the movie backwards? It increases, right? So as it keeps on increasing, there will come a time when the density will be so large that your whatever physical laws you have will break down. So can you tell me? So you can term it as density, you can term it as matter, you can term it as length also. So can you tell me what mass or what length scale, all your physical laws, and the physical laws that we have been talking till now are the classical physical laws, right? General relativity is a classical theory, it's not a quantum mechanical theory. So at what length scale that classical theory breaks down.
Yes.
Planck's scale, right? And how do you derive Planck's scale? Dimensional analysis and with what? With the universal constants, right? You have G, you have C, you have H. Using that, you can derive this Planck scale or Planck mass. You can define a Planck density also. So beyond that point, what happened, your physical theory at present cannot tell you. But it can at least tell you that there is a very, very denser universe to start with. Okay. So the way we understand that the evolution of the universe at present is the following, that there is a very dense universe. I'm not telling Big Bang. So Big Bang is something, the theory is called Big Bang. There is no event called Big Bang. This should be very clear. If you extrapolate this expansion back in time, which is, you are sinking this volume to a point which becomes a singularity in space-time, that event you may call a Big Bang. But the whole point is of telling you about the Planck length or Planck mass is that you cannot do that extrapolation, because there will be a radius here which will be around LP, where your physical theory breaks down. You cannot go even further. But you can go up to that point. So you know that the universe was very hot and very dense at some point. And to start with, there was something called inflation, which is that the universe expanded exponentially for some time. So that is required to solve some apparent paradoxes that we have today. But we will come to that in the one of the later classes. And inflation will be dealt on by Supratik, I guess, in detail. Supratik. So after the inflation has happened, you have this very early universe, which is very dense, and it has, the energy density is very high. And when the energy density is very high, what happens is, see, if I have, say, hydrogen atom, I put it in a temperature which is, or the energy density which is higher than its ionizing potential, then it will get ionized, right? Then if I give it enough energy, then the quark gluon will start to come apart from the nucleus. It has to be very high energy. So the universe was in a kind of quark gluon plasma, it is so said, to start with. Then as the universe cooled down, what happened was that you form this, form the protons and electrons separately. Protons are, proton and electron, if you combine, you will form the hydrogen atom, but that has not formed yet, say. So what will happen now? Your electrons will always get scattered off a nearby hydrogen atom, and you also have the photons, which are the energy, right? The energy, the photons will get scattered off by the electrons. So electron and the photons, the radiation and the matter will be in thermal equilibrium. For something to be thermal equilibrium, you need to have enough collision setting. And that collision, condition is there when the electrons and the protons has not combined to form the hydrogen atom. So in that case, since you have enough collision with the photons and the electrons cannot go very far. So what happens if the photon cannot go very far? Just think of you are inside a foggy morning. So you cannot see very far apart, right? Just because of this fog, the photons are not going very far. So universe was like that at some point of time. But then when the energy density so energy density is falling as the universe is expanding, that's what we got from the Spear analogy. And as the energy density fell by certain amount, you will have this hydrogen atom forming, combining the protons and the electrons. And once that has formed, now your photons does not have enough electrons to scatter off. So they can go free stream, right? So it's like a wall. So if I am looking at a wall, there may be photons inside the wall which are moving inside the wall but not being able to come out. But the photons which are at the surface of the wall, that has been able to come out, and that's why you can see the wall, right? So when these photons got decoupled from the matter, radiation got decoupled from the matter, that universe you will be able to see. Again, think of the fog analogy again. So if say I am looking at a cloud, I can only see the bottom part of the cloud, right? So that cosmic cloud we will be able to see. And where shall it be? It will be all around us, right? Because there is no certain space from where this thing happened. This thing happened everywhere in the universe. So that particular event is called the last, that particular surface in the universe, so to say, is called the last scattering surface. Because beyond that surface, the photons and the electrons were scattering each other. But after that, there is no scattering of the photon of the electron. The photon are directly coming towards us. So that's called the last scattering surface. That's there. And that radiation now you can see.
It seems to me that the time of
Penzias and Wilson, so what they are doing is they are making a antenna to detect the background noise around them. So basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to make a very good telecommunication system, and to know that, to make any signal, so if you are doing any signal processing, the first thing you have to understand is the noise. So that's what their goal was. And they found in every direction you look at, after taking care of all the noises possible, they found that every direction you look at, you have a noise corresponds to a temperature of 3 Kelvin. And if you make a map of that around us, and this is a projection, this is called a cartographic projection. This is the same way you project the surface of the earth in a piece of paper when you draw a map. So this is our galaxy basically. And in the galaxy you have, of course, a lot of noise because a lot of radiation coming from different parts in the galaxy. But if you look at any other direction, it's almost uniform, this noise. Okay? And this noise is nothing but that radiation which I was talking about. So it emitted from that dark scattering surface, and then this radiation has got, the density has decreased and decreased, and at present we measure its temperature at 3 Kelvin. So this is called the cosmic microwave background radiation. Cosmic because of its cosmic origin, microwave because 3 Kelvin corresponds to a wavelength which goes into the microwave, background because it's everywhere, you cannot take that radiation away, and it's a radiation. Is that a question?
So the same like the noise, right?
So getting Nobel Prize in cosmology is not one at a time phenomenon. So this is Penzias and Wilkinson probing cosmic microwave background. And then this 2.732 Kelvin was measured very crudely, so people said that we'll send a satellite up there in the sky, which will be in a very cooler environment compared to their laboratory experiment. And they will measure the temperature of the CMB. And remember, this temperature or this radiation is coming from a perfect black body. That's a black body, it's in thermal equilibrium, right? So you can define the radiation from a black body by a single quantity, which is temperature. So you can measure at different frequency what is the amount of radiation coming in. So you can get the spectra of the black body, which this Kobe satellite did. They got a spectra which looks like this. And these error bars are usually said to be 1,000 times magnified to show over there, which basically means that the black body that you see for the universe is the most black body that you can see in the universe. Okay, and that temperature is 2.732 or 2.74 Kelvin. So you can note that. Okay, now you have a problem. Okay, so I will come back to that. Just before that. Now you have a problem. The problem is the following. So this is the surface we have been talking about, where the matter radiation got decoupled, and where there you have everything very uniform. Uniform up to 10 to the 3 orders of magnitude, minus 3 orders of magnitude. And here, which is the present day, you see lot of structures, lot of galaxies, you see us. Right? So naturally the question arises that if something was so uniform, then how these structures are forming, right?
So you said that the microwave radiation is because of the temperature range being around 3 Kelvin.
3 Kelvin today.
Today. So
Yeah.
that it can go into some other part of
Frequency
the
tomorrow. Yeah, of
some
course.
other-
Yeah, of course. It will getting cool. It will cool down and go. Good. So what creates these fluctuations? So now, this theory of Big Bang will not be a viable theory if you cannot explain these fluctuations of the galaxies that has been formed today. Just think of it, that I have this, okay, think of that you have a matter distribution and it's completely uniform, okay, and it's infinite. If it is so today, there is no way you can form lump of matter forming here and there tomorrow. If you think of, okay, I'll come to the other analogy later. The only way you can form lump of matter here and there tomorrow is if you have a very small overdensities here and there today. So if there is a small overdensity, then it will attract matters from surrounding and it will grow up. The overdensity will grow up. This of course doesn't happen inside this room. If you have air inside this room and if I create a little overdensity here, it goes away very soon. Why does that happen? Because of pressure, right? Because as you try to pull up more matters, you have a pressure gradient forming and that takes matter away. So it again goes to similar density everywhere. But for universe where gravity is the force, it doesn't happen. So if you have a little overdensity, then you will grow matter there, more and more matter there, and the overdensity will grow up. So at that point, when the matter radiation decouple happen, there should be some overdensity or some underdensity at different places. If that is not there, then you cannot form these galaxies. So Kobe was also sent to measure if there is any such inhomogeneity in the microwave sky, and it measured it. So this is the inhomogeneity part in the Kobe. And as you can see, this part is a galaxy and they could not subtract it out. But as you can see, here you have more overdensity and here you have less density. So this is a temperature map, but the temperature you can directly correlate to the density. Okay. So these people got Nobel Prize because of that. So we are here, right? So once the matter and radiation got decoupled, the radiation is free stream now, and the matter has very small overdensity, and you don't have formed any stars or any galaxy, of course. This overdensity keeps on growing. It keeps on growing until it accumulates enough matter to form a star. And once it, okay. So the other thing happened here is, which I forgot to tell you, before that, as I told you that the electrons and the protons, they are free. So the universe is kind of ionized, right? Because if I can't think of a neutral hydrogen, the electrons and protons has to be bound together. Electrons and protons are ionized. So this era, which is also called recombination era, where the electrons and protons combine, after that the universe became neutral, right? And there is no radiation apart from the microwave background radiation. And you cannot see these little inhomogeneities because there is no radiation coming from those little inhomogeneities. But these inhomogeneities are growing up, growing and growing. So this part, you cannot see those inhomogeneities, so this is called the dark age of the universe. You cannot see, that's why dark. But the inhomogeneities are growing. And at some point it will accumulate enough matter to form a star. Whether a star was formed first or something else, that is not known very well. You can ask Raghu, who works on this. But so once you start forming those stars, what will they do? They will emit radiation, right? Once they start emitting radiation, they will start to ionize the surrounding, otherwise neutral hydrogen. Understand what's happening? Say I have So I have the neutral hydrogen, say hydrogen is neutral here, and hydrogen is thing of the entire universe is made up of hydrogen, which is very well true. Good approximation. And once I form a star, it will emit radiation and it will start ionizing the surrounding. And it will form an ionized bubble. And that's not the only star which has formed. There are stars nearby and that will form their own bubbles. And these bubbles will grow and at some point they will overlap and the entire universe will become ionized again. Right? So this is called reionization. So this era is called reionization, which again Raghu works on. And that happens over there. And as I said, the stars has started to form. You also form galaxies because you close in more stars, more matter. And eventually, the universe comes to the form that we are in today. So the reionization era is so after recombination, the reionization era is, the recombination is traced by, as I said, CMBR. Reionization is the other thing which is going to be probed in future, and a lot of people and a lot of effort is being done on that, a lot of projects also. So I want to show you a movie. It's just to give you a feel of what's happening. So this is a simulation box, of course, and if you see that there is a small thing which is forming, which is a star in the dark universe, and then it will start to grow. You see it has started to grow, and then other things are started to form, and it is ionizing its surroundings. And soon enough you have more objects and more. Actually, you don't be able to see the. Yeah. So this is the ionized region, and those you can think of the galaxies or the stars which are ionizing. And soon the entire universe, so they are growing now very rapidly. And this entire part of the universe, of course, will become ionized. So the only place where you still have neutral hydrogen are the very overdensity regions like galaxies, where you have the ionization, but also since the density is high, also have very high recombination rate. So the recombination wins over the ionization, and you still have the neutral hydrogen. So this completes the movie almost. So you can see this. These are supposed to be the galaxies, and the entire universe is now ionized, so you don't have any more neutral hydrogen floating around. So I had another movie which is not running, so yeah, I will end here. Don't call me sir from